next speaker, Kate Donald. Kate Donald is a human rights researcher and advocate. She worked as advisor and researcher to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. You can read more about her online. With that, I'm going to turn it over. Please help me welcome her.
Right. Thanks very much, Alison, and thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for everyone, including the students at McGill, for organising this event. So, as Alison says, I'm a human rights advocate. I'm not a tax expert, so that is the point of view I'm going to be speaking from. And traditionally, I think it's safe to say that human rights advocates have not engaged that much with tax policy. The framers of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, or the subsequent major international human rights treaties, weren't thinking that much about tax. Certainly they didn't include tax explicitly in the wording of the documents. So for most of the history of the human rights movement, we have demanded government spend money on, for example, training police officers, building schools, reducing poverty, but without thinking or talking much about how governments raise the money to pay for these things. Now, the inevitable pushback that human rights advocates get from governments when they make these demands is, we'd like to, we'll do it in the future, but right now we don't have enough money. This refrain has become even more common recently because of the effects of the global financial crisis, as I was just referring to. All the while, of course, billions of dollars are going overseas to tax havens, rich people and massively profitable corporations are getting away with paying little or no tax, and military spending dwarfs other areas of the budget. For example, just to throw in my one statistic, so I'm not going to be drowning you in stats, but for example, estimates in many African countries show that revenue losses from tax incentives were between 2 and 8% of GDP. Given that African countries spend between 2 and 9% of GDP on health, that is a lot of money that's being lost to corporate tax incentives that aren't necessarily effective in the first place. So increasingly, human rights advocates have begun to get ahead of the money argument rather than to avoid it. And some of the people here at this symposium were in the vanguard of that movement and still are. So how did I get involved? I was swept up in this quite recently. I was working, as Alison says, for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. For those of you in the audience who don't understand what that is, I will explain briefly, because I understand that the United Nations has many confusing mechanisms and titles. So the UN Human Rights Council, whose membership is made up of states, has appointed a number of experts to examine particular countries and issues. These experts are independent of their countries and of the UN, they receive no pay, and they usually serve for 6 years. And they report to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly on their designated topic. So the expert I was working for, whose name is McGill, who's from Chile, and her term has recently ended, was appointed the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty in 2008, tasked with examining barriers for people living in poverty all over the world and enjoying their human rights, and making recommendations to governments for how to improve their situation. As you can see, it's not the easiest task. So last year, after persuasion by some of our close allies, we decided to focus our last report to the Human Rights Council on tax. The idea was to lay out in an official UN document the profound impacts that tax policy can have on poverty and human rights, potentially positive, but in current practice often negative. We hope to put a human face on debates about tax collection, tax structures, and tax abuse. Now, I'll be talking about the report itself and the content of the report in more detail tomorrow for those of you that will be here. It is available online, but it's quite difficult to find currently, so if anyone really wants to read it, then come and speak to me afterwards and I'll email you the link. So tonight, as a recent convert, I'm just going to talk briefly about why human rights advocates and activists should be concerned about tax, and then in turn about why tax justice advocates should engage with human rights. So we can look at tax as having 3 main functions in human rights terms, and these overlap with many of the reasons why tax justice advocates and social justice advocates in general care about tax. So the first main function is resourcing. Very simply, taxes raise revenue that can be used to realise human rights. They pay for services, goods and institutions essential to our society, roads and piped water and hospitals and schools. And as President Obama acknowledged in his infamous, much misconstrued, "You didn't build that" speech, we all need and depend on these goods, rich people and corporations included. We all reap the benefits. But in particular, people living in poverty really rely on these services because they can't afford to go private. They rely on hospitals and schools and welfare benefits more than other sectors of the population. They simply can't realise that human rights to education, to health, or to social security without them. They therefore suffer more when these services are cut, when they're bad quality or inaccessible. This is a fundamental issue of equality, which is a core concern of human rights. Some would say the core concern. So which leads me to the next function of tax in human rights terms, which is redistribution. Tax, and in particular progressive direct tax, plays an absolutely fundamental role, as you all know, in redistributing wealth and income, and by extension power, and therefore in combating socioeconomic inequality. Progress towards equality and non-discrimination is of course a major human rights priority. Tax is an especially powerful lever to redistribute income and therefore combat economic inequality, but it's also relevant to other forms of inequality, including gender inequality, and there'll be a panel on that tomorrow. The third crucial element is to do with strengthening governance and accountability. So tax policy and tax systems can and should create more transparent and accountable societies, again as Alex was gesturing towards in his speech. Participation, transparency, access to information and accountability are all rights in themselves, and they help to combat power imbalances and strengthen democracy. This, of course, necessitates mechanisms for participation and also judicial oversight. So just briefly now, I'm going to set out my stall for why tax justice advocates should engage with human rights as relevant and useful principles and tools. And there'll be plenty more time for persuasion from various people here over the next 2 days, I hope. So first and foremost, human rights are powerful, normative and ethical standards. They provide another moral principled argument to use based on human dignity. They can help us to show the human face of bad tax policies or of tax abuse. Second of all, there's the legal aspect, of course. Human rights treaties establish binding legal standards on states. Despite the frequent pushback, these are existing commitments that governments have pledged to meet, with mechanisms to hold them accountable to doing so. And I'm not going to go through all the relevant human rights principles and standards because we'd be here all night, it would be very boring. But I'm just going to talk very briefly about 3 important human rights standards and principles that I think would be useful to tax justice advocates. So first of all is the issue of substantive equality. So equality is a word we hear all the time, but the understanding of equality in human rights law is quite specific. It's about equality in fact, not just in law. It's about addressing past discrimination and combating existing discrimination in culture, society, economics, and everyday life. So affirmative action is very much a part of this, and this goal applies across all areas of state policy according to legal human rights obligations, including fiscal and macroeconomic policy. Second of all, tucked away in International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is the obligation that all states parties, which includes the vast majority of countries in the world, including Canada, with a major exception being the United States, to use their maximum available resources to realise economic, social and cultural rights, like the rights to education and social security and an adequate standard of living. This is a potentially very powerful legal principle which has been underused thus far. And thirdly, human rights law creates a legal duty of international assistance and cooperation. States have to respect human rights beyond their borders as a legal duty, and to help weaker or poorer states to realise the rights of their populations. This has primarily been interpreted as applying to development aid, but when looked at through the frame of tax competition and tax havens, this duty takes on more interesting teeth. Okay, so I'm going to close up now with a bit of a rallying call. And I'm going to say that now I think really is the moment for linking tax justice and human rights, which is why I'm so glad that McGill has convened this event. So, what are we seeing at the moment? We're seeing unprecedented levels of public debate about inequality. Who would have thought that a 600-page book by French economists would be headline news and be on all the mainstream media? Austerity, as Alex said, is slashing public budgets across the developed and developing world, and we're seeing growing levels of public anger about this. Climate change and ecological crises are gathering force. There's growing evidence of adverse social and environmental impacts of corporate activities and increasing efforts to hold them accountable for these. And it's also an important moment in the international development world. The Global Development Agenda to succeed the Millennium Development Goals is currently being finalised, and I know that someone's going to talk about that on Friday. And one key question is how to finance these new development goals. Because the Millennium Development Goals were under-resourced by around 120 billion a year, and that's a key reason for the failure to meet many of these goals. which many people, including myself, would say weren't that ambitious to begin with. So it is an exciting moment. There does seem to be an upsurge in interest, action and concern around these issues. But we do have to acknowledge that this is a very, very difficult task. There are extremely powerful vested interests lined up against this cause. Business, big money, rich countries like Switzerland and the UK that have tax havens under their jurisdiction. And the only way to combat this is through attacks on many fronts. And it's likely, and I can certainly hope, that those of you in this audience have a strong role to play in at least one of these areas. So the first is clear-headed policy analysis and recommendations based on rigorous research. The second is legal strategies and advocacy, including in human rights forums. And the third, and I think this is absolutely key, is the social movement. And here it is fundamental that we get better at explaining to the general public why tax matters. Tax is part of the social contract, but the vast majority of people just see tax as a bureaucratic pain and a drain on their hard-earned money. And I think we've all fallen victim to that feeling at times. So we have to get a lot better at communicating the crucial importance of taxes, the central role they play in social justice and human dignity. And this is, I hope, where linking tax to human rights can prove particularly invaluable. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's wonderful. Every time I teach tax, I try to start over to try to convince a new crop of students that tax is about social rights. It's about the society. Tax is about society. So to hear you say it so eloquently is really an affirmation of what I keep trying to sell my students. So thank you.